The novice seized Brother Matthew's wrist as he folded the folio into his satchel. Suspicion tightened the narrator's attention. The act was precise, practiced, and inconsistent with charity copying. The boy's breath hitched. Brother Matthew, the novice demanded, "What is that sigil?" That single question forced the scriptorium into immediate confrontation and established the problem. Manuscripts intended for devotion were being concealed and might prove heretical. Within 5 steps the room filled with light from the single lamp on the catalogue table and the sound of pages shifting. The narrator watched the exchange without interfering at first, measuring. He catalogued motion, Matthew's gloved hand stalling, the novice's fingers hooked in the satchel strap, the folio's edge peeking like a sealed letter. Suspicion moved the narrator to act. He stepped forward with the air of a scholar checking inventory and asked, "Show me the shelf where that folio lived." His voice was calm, precise, the way a man who reads marginalia asks for facts. Brother Matthew did not meet the narrator's eyes immediately. He cleared his throat. "It was misfiled, Matthew. I meant to bring it to the infirmary for study." Matthew's hands were stained at the fingertips, ink dark in the grooves. "Matthew, the narrator, the folio bears a sigil I do not recognize." "Why hide it?" The question put a stake in the ground. Concealment or preservation, obedience or protection. The novice stepped back, pushing a chair with a scrape of wood. "I saw you, brother," he said. "You folded it wrong." It smelled of frankincense. The narrator noted the sensory detail. The novice smelled scent. Matthew hid papers. Those concrete facts shifted the dynamics from rumor to evidence. Matthew's jaw tightened. He produced a small iron key on cord and let it hang like a sign of custody. Outside the stacks, a lamp guttered when the door opened and the abbot's shadow crossed the threshold. The narrator sensed escalation. He set a hand on a copy of a catalogue and opened to the shelf index to hide the immediate focus. "We will inspect the shelf," he said. Quiet but firm. Brother Matthew swallowed. "Show me the shelf." Abbot Conrad ordered before anyone could maneuver away from his authority. They moved to the catalogue table where empty vellum slots stared like missing teeth. The narrator ran his finger along the ledger, noting dates, donors, and the small ink scratches that implied re-binding. A space between 2 identical folios had been wiped clean. Someone carved a blank here, the narrator observed. Someone removed a folio deliberately. The word deliberately allowed to anchor the danger. Deliberate concealment implied intent. A secret scribe, small of stature and quick-handed, hovered near the lectern. He had been copying for months and kept marginalia to himself. The narrator him for a recent copy. The scribe set a fresh folio on the lectern and tilted it under the lamp. When the narrator turned the page, his finger found marginal strokes. A clipped rubric, a distorted angelic sigil drawn inside the margins, and notation lines that read like instructions rather than praise. "This is not devotional." The narrator. "These marks are ritual marks." The scribe's mouth tightened. "I thought them prayers at first." The scribe. "Then I saw instructions between lines, times, offerings." A sealing formula, Benjamin. The novice leaned in. "Benjamin," the narrator, as if naming him, steadied the exchange. "Who taught you to read those marks?" Benjamin answered quickly. "I found them in the lower stacks near the repaired manuscripts." Brother Matthew moved a book late last night. Doubt began as a small tremor in the narrator's observation and widened to curiosity. He ordered that the folio be opened on the lectern. Matthew protested with a single, choking, "Not here." His protest was a physical interruption, not rhetoric. The abbot's approach had shifted the balance of power in the room. Authority now occupied the center. Abbot Conrad arrived with the thin paper of his official seal and a clerical marshal at his shoulder. He demanded inspection. "Hand me any book that is not catalogue." The abbot. His voice had the finality of a hammer. Brother Matthew clenched his fist around the satchel strap. The narrator met the abbot's gaze and held it, refusing supplication without evidence. A short argument followed, measured lines trading between preservation and obedience. You cannot protect everything, the abbot. These things spread error. And you would burn without proof. The narrator returned. The exchange was rapid. 3 short lines from one, 3 from the other, each sentence clean and intended to pin motives. The secret scribe tapped a page with a knuckle and said, "The marginalia say the prayer must be sealed after dusk." That sentence altered plans. Sealing after dusk suggested ritual timing, not mere quotation. The narrator and Matthew exchanged a look that carried agreement. They chose to translate the rubric in private, rather than surrender it to the marshal. Matthew's movements shifted from defensive to decisive. He pushed the satchel toward a small, shuttered clerestory alcove, while the abbot's back remained turned. The narrator had moved from suspicion into active partnership with Matthew. The alcove smelled of embers and old vellum. They closed the shutters against noon light and set the folio beneath a single candle. The secret scribe, whose hands had long trembled whenever he approached certain letterforms, knelt and opened the page. Fingers traced the ink, looped angelic names, a short prayer line, then a colophon that did not list the usual scribe or donor, but a string of names and dates. "Read aloud," the narrator instructed. The scribe's voice was low, precise. He read the prayer's rubric in clipped Latin, then hesitated over a line that included a directive to place ink sealed with lead. His hesitation was physical, a swallowed breath, a chin that tightened. It requests invocation. The scribe, not petition. Invocation, the language forced a shift from academic curiosity to procedural danger. Matthew's mouth moved without sound. He set a small iron chest on the table and unlocked it. He took out a lead capsule shaped like a tiny reliquary and set it beside the folio. "We will test restraint. Matthew." His voice had the thin edge of fear under resolve. The narrator understood the calculus. Demonstration might prove ritual intent and thus justify preservation. They prepared to enact the restrained ritual the folio described. Using a single line of the prayer and sealing it into the capsule, without completing the ceremony described in the rubric. The scribe would record, Matthew would handle the capsule, and the narrator would observe and catalogue. Doubt shifted toward calculation, and then to a tentative hope that evidence could be literal and contained. The prayer line glowed faint, where the scripture ink had been washed with a solution of lamp oil and sap. The scribe read the phrase and Matthew pressed the lead capsule, closed as the book instructed. The candle flame licked low. Outside, someone knocked on a distant door. The sound landed like news. An external event had arrived again as required. A messenger reported the abbot's inspection moving earlier than expected. The timing changed everything. Abbot Conrad's marshal moved faster. The narrator signaled for the chest to be covered. Matthew slid the folio beneath layered cloth. The marshal's footsteps grew closer. The scribe wrapped the folio with trembling hands and tucked it into Matthew's satchel. Benjamin stood at the alcove lip, eyes fixed. "Benjamin," Matthew whispered. "You must say nothing." Benjamin nodded and swallowed. The abbot burst into the space with 2 clerics, one holding a ledger of inspections. He demanded the archive be surrendered for audit. Voices rose. The narrator stepped between the abbot and Matthew and said, "Search the catalogue with me and tell me what is missing." The abbot barked an order. "Open the satchel," the marshal advanced. A struggle ensued when Matthew resisted. He pulled the satchel to his body and refused to hand it over. The marshal reached to pry the bag free. The narrator grabbed the marshal's wrist and said, "Wait. We will present the missing entry first." The marshal yanked anyway, and the satchel tore, a dull sound of cloth and leather. A lead capsule clinked against stone and struck the floor. Matthew lunged. The abbot moved toward the capsule. The narrator and the scribe dove for the folio. Hands collided. The clatter of movement, the scrape of chairs, and the curse of a cleric filled the chamber. In the scuffle, the lead capsule split open along its seam, and a small folded sheet slipped free, damp with ink and stamped with the same angelic sigil the novice had seen. A silence followed the crash. Everyone inhaled in the same instant. The marshals pressed staves against bodies. The abbot held the sheet between finger and thumb and read aloud the short prayer inside. At the first line he stopped, eyes narrowing. "This reads like an invocation," he said. He looked at Matthew and then at the narrator. "You will answer for this." The abbot's words carried the courtroom certainty of accusation. That moment functioned as the chapter's climax. Seizure, physical struggle, the capsule revealing active invocation. The narrator reacted with an immediate mixture of fear and procedural calm. He stepped forward and asked for permission to catalogue the sheet, voice steady. "If this is misread, you risk burning an indispensable witness," he said. The abbot hesitated. Matthew used that hesitation to shove the rest of the folio into his iron chest and slam the lid shut. Abbot Conrad ordered the room locked and the marshal to inventory all items. The narrator insisted on accompanying the inventory to make a record. The abbot accepted but assigned the narrator to remain under supervision. Outside the archive, the narrator sat for a single breath and felt a tightening in his jaw. His suspicion had become proof and proof had become accusation. The emotion shifted again from focused curiosity to a guarded fear that those who preserved might be punished. In Matthew's cell, the iron chest rattled against wood as Matthew secured the papers in a secret compartment. He counted names in the colophon aloud. Abbots and priors listed across decades, their handwriting overlapping. "There are others," Matthew whispered. He wrapped the small sheet in waxed linen and slid it into a hollow beneath the chest's false bottom. The narrator watched, saw Matthew's hands tremble, and noted the concrete acts of concealment. The secret scribe worked through the night, copying the most innocuous pages into a new binding, while leaving the ritual lines in the margins hidden. He hummed short prayers between strokes of the quill and muttered dates to steady his hands. "Scribe." The narrator. Who else wrote those names? The scribe hesitated, then said Abbot Renaud, Abbot Herve. Both gone to Rome 20 years apart, the names reframed the folio from a local oddity to evidence of a network. A mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived when the scribe produced a charred fragment he had rescued months ago from a burned binding. The fragment bore the same sigil. The narrator held the fragment and felt its scorched edge. "This matches," he said. The scribe's hand closed over the fragment as if it were proof and threat in the same thin rectangle. For a breath, everyone considered that the monastery itself had sheltered a longer history of organized invocation. By dawn they had a pact. Matthew, the narrator, and the secret scribe agreed to hide the most dangerous pages and to present the rest as scholarly interest. They arranged plausible provenance, mapped which pages to surrender and which to keep. "We preserve what we can, Matthew." His voice was small and direct. The plan required decisions and risk. Matthew chose to bear the immediate burden. Abbot Conrad's audit continued. He took the surrendered pages and catalogued them with clerical rigor. The narrator watched the abbot's pen and found a small margin notation that did not match the abbot's typical hand. It read like a previous owner's correction, an abbot's name repeated in a hidden line. The narrator noted the correction physically, recording it on a separate slip and hiding that slip in his own notebook. The external pressure did not abate. A clerical emissary from the ecclesiastical court arrived before dawn bearing a small cart and papers stamped in wax. The emissary requested to search the grounds. The marshal reported that charred fragments had been reported in neighboring priories. The narrator felt a new escalation. The hunt was coordinated. The narrator and Matthew concluded that the folios in question pointed to a clandestine network of abbots who had traded certain rites in secrecy. That revelation proved the twist. The monastery was not only harboring texts, it sat on a record of prior leadership involvement. The knowledge altered how the narrator understood the earlier missing folio. It was not an isolated act, but a link in a chain. Matthew sealed the iron chest and hid the lead capsule fragments inside a coil of rope. the narrator where he had placed the waxed linen and asked the narrator to promise to speak only in the presence of the scribe. The narrator agreed, nodding. The pact was concrete, specific actions, hidden compartments, and a recorded list of names. This closed the chapter's mini-conflict. The immediate struggle had been resolved by concealment and careful record-keeping. At dawn, the emissary paused at the cloister gate with a charred fragment on a small board. He held it out like evidence and asked to speak with the abbot. The narrator watched from a distance as Matthew tightened his hand on the iron chest key. The chapter ends not with a new beginning nor with resignation, but with a precise action. Matthew turned the key once more and pressed the lid shut, while the emissary raised the charred fragment to the light. The narrator catalogued the day's events in his notes with neat marginalia. The novice's discovery, the translation in the alcove, the capsule's rupture, the abbot's seizure, the pact of concealment, and the charred fragment at the gate. He wrote each item as a concrete line of evidence. The final entry read like an instruction. Keep the names, conceal the methods, and trace the network. Then he closed his notebook and slipped it into his overcoat before the emissary could pass the gate with his board of fire, scorched vellum. Outside, the cart creaked as the emissary turned away, and Matthew counted again the names he had hidden under the chest's false bottom. The narrator's hand closed on a sheet of vellum before he saw the faces in the alcove. The folio pulsed with a faint, pale light between Brother Matthew and Novice Pierre, and suspicion drove the narrator down the narrow stair faster than courtesy allowed. Stop. The narrator and his voice cut the reliquary like a struck bell. A candle guttered. Pierre dropped his head and Matthew shoved the folio beneath a frayed cloak with fingers that smelled of ink and smoke. Suspicion shaped every move for the narrator in that moment. He had come to the reliquary because of a whisper and a half, remembered theft. Because the novice had seized Matthew's wrist days earlier and demanded to know what the sigil meant. That memory sat beside the present scene. Pierre's grip on Matthew's skin. Matthew's practiced concealment. The central problem was concrete and immediate. A forbidden manuscript was exposed in the archive at midnight, and the abbey might soon learn what the two men tried to hide. He stepped forward and took Matthew's elbow. Brother Matthew, the narrator, naming him to halt any evasive motion. Matthew's jaw tightened. His ink-stained fingers fumbled the cloak as if to offer the folio. Quietly, Matthew hissed. "We were only," read it, the narrator interrupted, and his tone left little room for half-truths. The reliquary smelled of old wax and damp stone. Narrow shelves held reliquaries and bone boxes that no one opened after Vespers. The narrator had been in abbeys before. He kept his temper measured. Now the concrete danger sharpened him. If a stranger learned of the folio, inquisitors might arrive. If the folio's marginal prayers reached the wrong hand, lives and reputations would be lost. He positioned himself between Matthew and the vault's arched mouth and watched for motion. Pierre's voice broke when he spoke. "I sent a scrap to Father Anselm, to the man at the village. I did it because I thought," his words faltered, "Pierre, Matthew," and his tone snapped from prayer to command. "You sent what?" The narrator demanded. The question landed like a hammer. That exchange forced the first emotion shift. Suspicion loosened into alarm. Matthew shoved the cloak aside and revealed the folio. The ink on the margins glimmered as if it had its own light source. Sigils curled like insect legs around names written in cramped, single-stroke hands. The narrator read a phrase that had been crossed out in quick, furious strokes, and he felt the second emotion shift. Alarm gave way to cold, practical fear. He understood then that the folio was not a pious exercise, but a doctrinal threat. How long has this been hidden? The narrator. His question demanded inventory and origin, not rumination. Matthew answered with measured, clipped sentences. "Years. I catalogued it when I took the keys, but I kept it from the register. The abbey's ledger must never hold this." He touched his rosary beads. The odd metallic sigil clicked against his fingers. Brother Matthew. The narrator? You know what sending even a fragment means. The bishop will not treat this as a curiosity. He will treat it as heresy. Outside the vault, a torch knocked against the outer door, and a boot scraped the flagstones. The sound was the second external event in the chapter, and it arrived within the required rhythm of plot movement. Matthew's shoulders dropped a fraction. Who goes? He muttered. A voice called from the corridor. Inventory at first light. Brother Conrad says the steward must see the lower vaults. The narrator counted the cost immediately. An inspection would either expose the folio or force Matthew to invent a plausible explanation. Matthew's fingers betrayed him. They trembled when he tried to flatten the page. Help me, Pierre whispered, and the whisper was equal parts plea and panic. The narrator moved, not to seize the folio, but to study the marginalia, close enough to judge risk. The script shifted under his eyes. Names of angels written in forms that avoided ecclesiastical orthodoxy, prayers that stacked commands as if bargaining with a being rather than pleading to God. The narrator's reaction was physical. He set his square jaw, felt his tongue dry, and reached for the brass sextant pendant beneath his overcoat as a talisman to steady his hands. Brother Conrad's knock returned, louder. Pass the key, Matthew, Conrad ordered from the threshold. Matthew flinched. Brother Matthew. Conrad, when he stepped in, torchlight hard in his face. His presence carried duty. His face was a map of ledger nights and counts of grain. We open at dawn. The prior demands order. He scanned the vault and noticed the moved clay pots and the displaced dust. His gaze sharpened and focused on a smear of candle wax near the alcove. Conrad's inspection raised stakes. The narrator knew that a steward's ledger would not tolerate anomalies. The abbey's hierarchy preferred simple answers. He decided, in a deliberate, low voice, to force transparency in a controlled way. Show him nothing but a common folio. The narrator. We will present an old office manual and make safe the rest. Matthew objected immediately. No. The folio cannot be brought before the steward. He will open the chest, he will see the ink, and he will call the prior. Father Helmut will order a purge. I cannot. Matthew's refusal was not theatrical, it came from a clear calculus. He weighed doctrinal shame against the archive's survival. His hands tightened on the folio until knuckles paled. An argument followed that fulfilled the requirement for rapid back and forth. Matthew, you hide and the abbey burns. The narrator. Matthew, you expose what must sleep. Pierre broke in. Brother Conrad must be deceived. Matthew insisted. We cannot lead him into falsehood. The narrator replied. We must choose which lie spares more than one soul. Matthew shot back. The exchange contained 5 lines and each name was spoken so listeners could track the speakers. A plan formed. Matthew would produce a decoy folio with mundane liturgical notes while the narrator proposed a risky procedure. Render the folio unreadable to outsiders by binding it with a ritual seal and stow it in a lead box disguised among reliquaries. The narrator suggested the ritual as a protective method that preserved the text for study while denying access to a priestly inspection. Matthew resisted. He equated ritual concealment with collusion. That resistance enacted another emotion shift. Anger at the risk became moral hesitation. You would make a secret of Scripture, Matthew. You would use occult means in a house of God. His voice cracked on the last word. The narrator countered by naming consequences. If the folio reaches the bishop, they will not debate meaning. They will confiscate, they will burn, they will tear pages to find origin. The text will be lost. Whom do we protect? A doctrine or this ink? The debate moved quickly, and the narrator kept the tempo short and precise. Pierre's confession returned the scene to crisis. I sent a scrap to a layman in the market. I thought he might advise me. He has learned, he is curious, he promised safety. The twist altered immediate understanding. The threat was already outside the abbey. The narrator felt fear harden into a professional resolve. Who is this man? He demanded. Father Anselm. The deacon. Pierre's face closed. No name. a man with a shop that sells prayer beads. He promised to forward to scholars. The line cut to nothing as Matthew slapped a hand over Pierre's mouth. Their choices contracted into timelines. The steward would inspect at first light. The messenger rumor suggested an anonymous tip might have already reached the bishop. Now the narrator and Matthew had to decide if the folio could be disguised quickly enough, whether closing the leak with the layman was even possible, and whether their actions would be judged as cowardice or preservation. The narrator proposed the binding ritual to be performed in the secret scriptorium. He spoke plainly about the steps, each action practical. A linen sheet to wrap the folio, molten lead to make a casing, a wax seal to mark custody. He explained that the ritual words he planned to use were not invocations, but mnemonic devices. Phrases arranged to scramble the folio's script to any cleric who did not know its reading key. Matthew's protest returned with moral force. You would hide errors beneath Latin and lead, Matthew. If you speak those words, you become party to deception. The narrator watched Matthew's hands, watched how his thumb pressed deep into papery skin until the nail whitened. The narrator, Matthew, choose. Confession now and loss, or concealment now and survival. You must decide. The choice forced Matthew's next move and shifted his emotion from guilt to pragmatic sacrifice. An emissary and knock interrupted them again, this time sharper and colder. A messenger stood at the reliquary threshold, flower, dusted cloak and a sealed letter borne on a cord. He declared, from the bishop, an order: open the lower vaults at dawn. An anonymous informant mentioned irregular holdings. The message changed their calculations. The narrator's chest tightened physically. He felt the muscle under his ribs clench and his mouth dry. The external pressure had become real and public. The steward's ledger and the bishop's warrant now threatened the archive directly. Matthew's face emptied. He composed a statement and said aloud, I will answer. I will take the blame. I will say these are mine. Seal them under church custody. Spare the others. The sentence contained sacrifice and calculation. The narrator processed the consequences in a sequence of small actions. The narrator watched Matthew put his iron key on the cord. Watched Matthew place his rosary over the folio like a claim. Watched his shoulders set as if bracing for a lash. The ritual began, but unease strained every motion. The narrator laid the folio on a wooden table, placed a linen sheet over it, and wrapped the edges tight. He read aloud the mnemonic phrases he had prepared, each line brisk and functional. He poured molten lead into a small, prepared casing and slid the wrapped folio in while Matthew held a tremorous hand at the lid. Pierre hovered, wiping sweat into his habit. The narrator focused on mechanical detail to steady himself. The weight of the ladle, the sound of hot metal meeting cold, the smell of scorched linen. Halfway through, the ink on the folio flared and lifted. Lines peeled from the page and hung in the air for a heartbeat like smoke caught in a draft. Pierre convulsed and dropped to his knees. His throat worked. The narrator grabbed his arm and the sudden action became the climax. The room's light fractured across the lead tray. A cry came from the corridor, Brother Conrad, returning early at a prior's summons. The vault doors opened and the prior entered with 2 clerics at his heels. They found the reliquary scattering wax and a disrupted table and a boy on his knees. The arrival forced immediate confrontation and the section reached its narrative apex. Conrad barked questions. What is happening here? Who has tampered with the reliquary? The narrator's answers needed brevity. He did not recite motives. He placed Matthew forward, Brother Helmut, Matthew to the prior, and his voice was stripped of plea. These are my texts. I kept them from the register. The prior's eyes narrowed to ledger lines. You kept what, Helmut? Accusation followed accusation in heated exchange. Matthew hid texts. Cried, Matthew, this is an offense against order, Helmut declared. Matthew repeated his claim and allowed the prior to seize the folio. The lead casing cracked in the prior's hand and dull light leaked from within. Helmut's face reversed as he glimpsed the margin. His fingers went white on the page's edge. To avert an immediate purge, Matthew took a final decision. He claimed sole responsibility for unauthorized texts and invoked clerical obedience as his defense. A compact tale of curiosity turned to error and asked for mercy on the grounds of ignorance. The prior consulted his steward, and the messenger then ordered the folio sealed and consigned to the bishop's custody. Matthew bowed his head and accepted the penalty. The narrator watched the transaction and recorded the marginalia in shorthand on a scrap of vellum he had prepared. The room calmed into bureaucratic motion. Forms, seals, and chords. The narrator did not speak. He layered facts in his mind, noting gaps and noting names. He had the scrap of marginalia hidden between his fingers, a few strokes that hinted at correspondence beyond the abbey. He knew that the outside man might already be reading their words, and that the exchange could not be undone by confession alone. Dawn broke with a pale cut of light through the cloister windows as the prior marched the group out with the sealed folio in tow. The narrator remained behind a moment longer, gathering the fallen ink knives and the linen that had browned at the edges. He slid a tiny torn corner of the manuscript into his sleeve where the seam could hide it. The physical act of concealment was not a proclamation. It was a small, precise theft done to preserve a clue. Matthew went forward willingly, shoulders square as orders were read, but his eyes met the narrator over the prior's shoulder. No words passed, a single nod conveyed both apology and trust. The narrator had moved through suspicion, alarm, and fear. He ended the chapter with a narrowed resolve. He left the abbey by a side gate while dawn smudged the roofs in grey. The scrap of marginalia warm against his palm and the memory of pious confession curled behind his teeth. He would trace the man in the market. He would find Father Anselm or the shopkeeper who had promised safety. He would map names and paths one by one, but first he had to move the folio's evidence farther from the abbey's ledger. He tightened his coat against the cold air, felt the brass weight of the sextant against his sternum, and walked away without looking back. The last image is concrete. The narrator's hand slips the fragment into a hollow of his walking stick before he passes the first turn in the lane, and the abbey's bell rings the hour. The chapter ends on that action. The narrator does not deliver a speech. He does not declare new purpose. He places the marginal scrap into the cavity, locks it with a twig, and steps into the town. The morning sunlight lit the stone unevenly. A single carriage rolled past, and the narrator adjusted his stride to follow its direction, setting toward the market where an unknown correspondent waited to widen the story. Emotion root. Suspicion opened the scene and pushed the narrator into intervention. Shifted into alarm when the folio's glow exposed risk, and then into fear when Pierre revealed the outside correspondence. Matthew's moral resistance, Pierre's betrayal, and the prior's arrival forced the narrator to move from analysis into decisive concealment. Two clear emotion shifts occurred: suspicion to alarm, then alarm to fear and pragmatic resolve. The chapter resolves its mini-conflict. Matthew takes the blame and the folio is removed from the abbey, while the narrator departs with a stolen scrap that promises a new line of inquiry. The last beat is an action. He hides the scrap in his stick and heads for the market. So the chapter ends with a tangible, situational cue that leads into the next chapter. A hand yanked Brother Matthew backward and the lead capsule skittered across the cold flagstone. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as candles clattered and novice Pierre shouted, "Stop!" The abbot's boots sounded on the stair while the capsule rolled into a pool of spilled wax and ink. The immediate problem was concrete. A forbidden prayer, sealed by Matthew into lead, lay exposed, and the monastery now faced a choice between destruction and preservation. The narrator moved between the three men with measured steps, counting threats rather than naming them. He had catalogued manuscripts in 5 cloisters. He knew what a sealed prayer could mean for fragile order. Brother Matthew kept his hands splayed on his chest, palms stained with ink, eyes fixed on the capsule. Novice Père stood with his back to the archway, fingers slick where he had gripped the folio earlier. The abbot stopped at the stair lip and said, "Who else knows of this?" The question placed the danger plainly. Exposure would invite a purge. Brother Matthew's voice came fast and raw, "Only the necessary." He looked at the narrator. "Only those who keep the books." His throat worked. His wrists flexed like a man unused to holding back panic. The narrator heard the memory of an earlier theft at work. The novice seizing Matthew's wrist as a folio was folded into a satchel in the scriptorium, and understood why Matthew had tried to seal the prayer. That previous night had left an imprint. A practiced hand, the boy's breath hitching, and the folio pulsing with a pale light between them. The absence of secrecy now meant immediate danger for anyone connected to those folios. They argued in clipped sentences. "Brother Matthew, the abbot, you will give the folios to me." "No," Matthew answered, fingers tightening as if on an invisible ledger. Novice Père stepped forward. "Abbot, the texts are dangerous," he said. The narrator watched each face for the concrete signs of a change in resolve, tensing jaw, the slight turn of shoulders, the way hands left or sought a pocket. Emotions moved through bodies as actions. The first external event after the seizure arrived in the form of two lay brothers pushing past the abbot, torches swinging, their leather boots scraping stone. The door to the archive banged open. One of the lay brothers called, "We have orders to confiscate heretical material." The command converted abstract fear into immediate custody risk. The narrator stepped between Matthew and the lay brothers, palms open, voice low. "Show us the edict," he said. "We have rules for inspection." The abbot did not answer. He watched Matthew instead. Matthew produced the lead capsule from his robe with deliberate slowness. He lifted it like a reliquary, as if presenting evidence in a tribunal. The narrator could see the iron key on Matthew's cord, the rosary beads with their odd metallic sigil, and the ink-stained fingertips that had sewn margins late at night. "Matthew, this is not blasphemy. This is record and ritual tied to prayer forms older than these cloisters." The abbot barked a laugh that contained no humor. "Older or not, you place souls at risk. The bishop will hear of this." The abbot's words drove the stakes inward. Possible episcopal wrath, confiscation, burning. The narrator's mind catalogued options as actions: negotiate custody, hide a duplicate, resist confiscation, or submit to the purge. His decision-making moved with his fingers. He checked the field notebook at his belt, felt its worn leather, and thought of the copied sigil he had begun to trace days before. Suspicion was his operating emotion. It threaded each choice and altered his listening. When Matthew spoke again, the narrator leaned closer. "If you burn these, Matthew, you destroy forms of speech that bind a community. These rites altered allegiance once." He made a small motion toward the capsule, and Novice Père flinched. The narrator spoke fast then. "Bring the folios to daylight under witnesses. If the bishop's men demand proof, we will produce a record of custody." The abbot slammed a hand on the nearest table. "We will not parade heresy like relics." The force of his hand threw a quill across the table and sent a stack of folios sliding. Folios came into play again as an active element. Lay Brother 1 bent and gathered the scattered sheets, revealing a marginal note that had not been there in standard liturgical copies. The ink along the margin bulged, then softened as if wet. The narrator reached for the sheet and felt a small tug along his fingertips, an involuntary pull at attention. The marginal ink swelled visibly for everyone in the alcove. The abbot stepped back and muttered, "What is that?" The physical reaction was unmistakable. Eyes narrowed, a hand raised to the throat, a quick swallow. This was the second external event in quick succession, the sigil's strange movement. When the folio pulsed, emotions shifted. Suspicion slipped toward fear among the lay brothers. Matthew's hands shook, but he refused to hand anything over. The narrator felt the compulsion too, a brief interest that made arguments sound more persuasive than they were. He resisted by describing what he saw aloud. "The ink is reacting to exposure," he said. "Observe the edges." The pigment lifts from the vellum. His voice was calm but firm, and his description grounded others. Words anchored the room while sight and touch tugged at wills. The abbot gave a command then, "Seal the archive." No one leaves. Two lay brothers moved to the door, and the abbot closed the stair behind them. The narrator noticed how the abbot kept his back to the stair and his gaze fixed on Matthew, suspicion returning to him as authority. When everyone was contained, Matthew dropped to his knees and begged, "Do not burn everything. There are copies hidden. Let me protect them. Let me preserve what matters for study." His voice broke on a particular consonant. His hands found the capsule and shielded it as if it were his heart. The narrator measured the plea against visible facts. Matthew's habit bore discreet esoteric stitching. His rosary had a different weight. The boy's earlier theft suggested internal division within the cloister. The narrator, "Where are the copies?" Matthew gave a place, an old chest beneath the sacristy table, and a method for verifying them. The abbot did not accept the answer. He ordered the chest opened. Novice Pierre hesitated, then moved toward the sacristy. The narrator saw the boy's palms damp with sweat despite the cold, and the way Pierre avoided Matthew's gaze. Pierre whispered to the abbot, "Brother Matthew acts alone, abbot. He hides things that could harm us." The narrator watched Matthew's face go slack for a beat, then harden into a pleading mask. An emotion shift happened in Matthew. From desperate hope to resigned terror, the abbot snapped, "Open it, Pierre." This exchange forms the third external event. Pierre delivering the chest, and the abbot demanding proof. Pierre opened the chest with fingertips that trembled. Inside lay folios wrapped in oilcloth, a brass sextant pendant in a nest of vellum, and a folded duplicate the narrator recognized from earlier cataloging. The abbot seized the duplicate and held it under the torch's light. The marginal sigils glowed faintly. The abbot barked, "Bind them for the bishop. Burn or sequester as ordered." Matthew lunged. The narrator stepped between them and blocked Matthew with a shoulder, forcing him down by the elbow. The confrontation tightened. "Matthew, the narrator, you have kept these to protect ritual memory, not to corrupt worship. You must answer. Who else has knowledge?" Matthew spat a single name, Novice Pierre. The abbot's eyes sharpened. Pierre stammered, "I only did what I thought would save the monastery." 3 to 6 quick lines of dialogue followed as the abbot pressed Pierre for motive, and Pierre answered haltingly. This back and forth made the betrayal concrete rather than abstract. Pierre's action had shifted custody and trust. His betrayal changed the power dynamics. When questions turned to Pierre, Matthew made a sudden move to snatch a folio free. The narrator grabbed his wrist and held tight. Matthew hissed, "Let it go." "You will not." He stopped when the abbot stepped forward and spat a single word. "Confiscation." The room's rhythm sped. Footsteps, the rustle of robes, and the scrape of chairs rose into a metallic chorus. This is where the cliffhanger arrives. Someone at the doorway shouted that the bishop's men were approaching. Every head jutted toward the stair. The external event forced choices to accelerate. The panic that followed was a shift from fear to urgency. Matthew whispered hoarsely, "If they seize everything, all knowledge dies." "You know what they did near Beauvais?" The narrator saw the memory in his hands, a folded sheet with a burned corner, and understood that Matthew had catalogued past purges as evidence. The abbot's decision hardened. "Then we will act cleanly. We will destroy what must be destroyed and hide what we can." He called for a bonfire outside the cloister. Novice Pierre moved without looking at Matthew. He held a hidden folio in both hands and stepped toward the abbot. "Abbot," he said, "I brought one. It is safe with me." The narrator watched Matthew flinch as if struck. The boy's act could be protection or betrayal. The narrator could not tell. He noted visible cues, Pierre's jaw set tight, his eyes looking away from Matthew. The way his fingers tightened around the folio, and factored them into the assessment. This unexpected move altered assumptions and led to a fast sequence of physical actions. Lay brothers forming a ring, Matthew moving to block Pierre, and the abbot signaling for a torch. The climax came when hands collided and the lead capsule tipped. Ink spilled onto the table. The spilled ink did not merely stain. It filled the air with a thin smoke that smelled of iron and something floral Matthew called angelic resin. The smoke coalesced into a sigil shape above the table, and the air carried a precise pressure on the temples of those near it. One lay brother staggered, clutching his head. The abbot's face registered a sudden blankness before he clenched his jaw and drew his knife. The narrator lunged to snatch the capsule, his sleeve catching charcoal. He felt a tug at his memory, sudden recall of the folio that had pulsed before, and then a new understanding settled in his bones. These rites changed more than words. They could alter allegiance. The physical scuffle that followed lasted less than a minute but contained multiple turning points. Matthew shoved Pierre. Pierre shoved back. The abbot struck Matthew with the flat of his hand. The narrator pulled Pierre away and shoved him against a shelf. The spilled ink crawled across the table like a spreading stain and then lifted into the sigil again, wrapping itself around the nearest candle flame and blackening it. In the motion, someone fell. The narrator heard a wet thud and smelled scorched vellum. A lay brother lay on his side, breathing shallow through a hand pressed to a darkening stain at his temple. This was the climax beat realized. Ritual breaks and ink breathers, producing bodily consequences and irreversible damage. After the scuffle, the room was a map of injury and smoke. Matthew crouched with his hands on a singed folio, blood bright where ink and flame had met. Novice Pierre's face had gone pale. His elbows bore cuts from a shelf. The abbot sat rigid, eyes wide, and then closed for a moment before he reached for the nearest folio and began tearing pages. He tore them methodically, as though obedience could be enacted by pattern. The narrator caught the motion and acted. He slipped a hidden duplicate from his field notebook and tucked it inside his coat, where the abbot could not see. He did so without a word. His hands worked in the pause between the abbot's shouts. The abbot called for a purge and issued an edict. The damaged folios would be burned, copies confiscated, and an inquiry launched. Matthew fell to his knees in front of the abbot and begged for mercy. "Allow me to keep one copy under oath. Let the knowledge survive under accountability." The abbot looked at the narrator. The narrator felt the room measure him by his choices. He could defy the abbot and risk exile, or he could bargain. He chose bargaining. "Abbot, you will permit one bound copy to be placed in the diocesan archive with witnesses present. I will oversee the transfer." The abbot hesitated and then nodded once. The decision shifted the immediate threat into a negotiated control. This is the quiet bargain beat. Novice Pierre's betrayal, or his attempt at protection, changed the distribution of power. Matthew retained one singed folio. The narrator had a hidden copy. The abbot had public authority and an edict to show the bishop. The lay brothers had scars on their hands where they had fallen, and the archive bore new ruin. The narrator watched Matthew press his forehead to the singed folio as if pressing a wound closed. This physical action contained grief, resignation, and an unwilling acceptance of loss. At first light, the narrator climbed the cloister roof and opened his field notebook beneath a slate sky. He took a pen and traced, slowly and precisely, the sigil he had seen form from ink and smoke. Each curve mirrored the motion the ink had taken on the table. He felt Matthew's plea in the pressure of his hand on the page, and Novice Pierre's betrayal in the trimmer that caught in his fingers. When he finished, he slid the page into the inner pocket of his coat and tucked the notebook under his arm. He paused only long enough to watch the sigil on the paper dissolve as sunlight struck it until it looked like damp ink on vellum rather than something alive. Then he folded the notebook and left. Outside the cloister, the abbot convened a small council and read the edict aloud. He arranged witness names and ordered procession to the bishop. Matthew was placed under watch, not immediately imprisoned. Novice Pierre was commanded to present himself as penitent and assigned menial tasks. The narrator accepted his compromise. He would deliver the bound copy under the abbot's supervision, but he would not reveal where the hidden duplicates were kept. He understood the cost. His silence would protect knowledge but invite suspicion of complicity. Two surprises remained. First, the narrator discovered in his coat a second hidden page he had not placed there. A duplicate Matthew had slipped into his notebook during the scuffle. Second, Novice Pierre, later that day, slipped a folded scrap to Matthew under the pretense of a broom shift. Matthew opened it and found a short line of ink. "Forgive me." Matthew's hands trembled as he folded the scrap into the singed folio. These moments changed how each man would act in the days ahead. The narrator recognized that trust had been rearranged by actions, not by proclamations. By midday, the monastery had a new order. The abbot had his edict to present, Matthew had a vow to answer, and the narrator carried a copy hidden to preserve ritual memory. Novice Pierre moved about with an expression that shifted between relief and constant worry. The narrator watched him and marked how the boy's shoulders sank when he thought no one watched. That physical slump signaled ongoing remorse and doubt. The narrator walked out of the cloister with his field notebook, keeping his head down against the wind that smelled faintly of char. He had preserved the sigil on paper, hidden a duplicate, and arranged for a bound copy to be lodged where the bishop's men would register receipt. He had made a bargain that would keep the monastery intact, while ensuring the fragile rituals did not disappear entirely. The choices had cost friendships and opened secrets to episcopal scrutiny, but they had also kept a line of knowledge alive. The final image of the morning. Matthew standing at the sacristy doorway holding the singed folio to his chest, while Novice Pierre turned away to sweep ashes. The narrator paused and watched their hands. Matthew's fingers, ink-stained and collused, gripped the folio as if measuring the depth of damage. Pierre's hand trembled with the broom handle. The narrator put his notebook away and walked on. He carried both the burden of secrecy and the proof of compromise in his pockets. The chapter closed on a concrete action. The narrator folded his coat tighter and crossed the monastery gate with a copied sigil hidden inside his field notebook. Emotion root. Suspicion had driven the narrator's decisions from the first seizure to the final bargain. The narrative contained two clear shifts. Suspicion, fear, urgency during the seizure and ink revelation, and betrayal, grief, guarded resolve following Pierre's hand in the scuffle. Each shift showed itself in actions, gripped wrists, turned faces, torn folios, not in abstract labels. The small choices, Matthew's plea, Pierre's slipped scrap, the narrator's hidden duplicate, resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. A violent confrontation, an enforced purge, and a compromised preservation of forbidden knowledge. The narrator left the cloister carrying both the knowledge and the consequences of keeping it.